It makes sense to me that as we take up this worship and work today, that we would consider the life and ministry of one of my favorites, John the Baptist. Not only because it's John that helps us prepare ourselves for the birth of Christ in just a few weeks, but also because of John's vocational clarity in service to the lordship of Jesus of Nazareth. We find John first doing what he does best in the gospel lesson just read, baptizing. Crowds came out to be baptized by him, Luke says. You have to admire John. He's crystal clear about his calling. His was to baptize, to ritualize the friend-making that God offers through water and spirit. The enlarging of the family of God through the mercy of God's gracious offering of a second chance. Or in the case of the baptism of the very, very young that we do, to give them the best shot at a first chance. John apparently loved to stand in the mud with sin-stained people as a sin-stained person himself. Of the many tasks we're called to take up as ordained servants of the gospel, our first work and greatest calling is to affirm, commend, and create space for people to be baptized. Why our first work and greatest calling? I'm glad you asked. Because Howard Thurman is right. He's right when he said God is biased towards the future. And baptism is how God calls the church and all of her ministers to announce and shape an audacious future. And so, like John, we are called to be ready to offer baptism without apology, far and wide, high and low. We are to find the conviction, to pray that God will help us to be a conduit for baptism. And we are to gain the courage and the corresponding words to raise the possibility of baptism rather than to simply facilitate it when other people bring it up. Baptism is a revolutionary act. By water and spirit, we find belonging, a deepening belief, and the means to become increasingly like Christ. Through baptism, we get the high privilege of insisting on and standing in a moment of unique sincerity with people, just like John. Sincerity is what the second sentence of today's gospel is all about. You snakes, John said. Who told you to slither down to the river today? Some people were coming out to see the spectacle of John, but they forgot to pack their sincerity. Attention to spectacle over sincerity is an occupational hazard for those of us who work in the church. But sincerity, beloved, is all God really asks. Some came to the river that day for the latest installment of religious entertainment. But John was ever clear, and John would have none of it. Some misunderstand John's clarity as extremism, but they miss God's grace in John's insistence. His insistence communicates his confidence in God's search and rescue mission. In his insistence is the knowledge of the damage of an untethered life. In his insistence is the celebration of the pursuit of God's goodness and mercy at work in baptism. We should offer baptism frequently, earnestly, gently, and boldly, because we ourselves have been humbled by its gracious invitation and sustaining power in our lives. I'm talking to somebody today. Today, you 5 make vows to become deacons and priests, but never forget this. The vows you make today are but a specific way to live out your promises first made at baptism. Like a good deacon or priest, John anticipates how people will respond to his clarity, and John beats him to the punch. Don't say that just because you have Abraham as your ancestor, that you're all exempt of this, John tells the crowd. Now, help me out now. What would be the Episcopal version of that sentence? You know what it is. It would go something like this. John, don't lecture me about faith. Don't you know that I am a cradle? Or in another matter, John, don't lecture me. Don't you know that I have been a member of this church since I was a child? But here's the thing. John knows heredity or longevity isn't the same thing as fidelity. Life, not lineage, is God's standard of measurement. All devices that maintain innocence or illusion must be abandoned. That's John's good news. John gets reality in the room because John knows how people will try to domesticate his message. And we should know, as we ordain today, how people will attempt to domesticate the gospel in our time. You 5 are being called to be ordained right now, at this time, when Jesus has become a victim of unprecedented identity theft. Some have made him a rabid nationalist. Some would make him a political pawn. Some have made him an apolitical personal good luck charm. Others have made him just a groovy dude with no expectations for us at all. The church's work, our privilege is to reintroduce the Jesus of the Bible to his church first and then to the world that he loves. By word and deed, that is what John does. And this continues to be our purpose. At the Jordan, John refuses to dumb down God. What he does is to onboard people to God and invite them to wrestle with God, sharp edges and all. That is our calling. The church, breaking news, is not a philosophy club where we gather to simply savor ideas. The church is a cult of personality, and the personality is Jesus of Nazareth. John is clear about that. The world says, show us what you do, show us how much you have. But here we say, like the woman by the well, let us introduce you to somebody we have met. You cannot commend with integrity what you do not know for yourself. John understood this. John's ministry was all about this. And as impactful as it was, his ministry, it was also subordinate, and it sustained the celebrity of Jesus Christ. John's clarity came from recognizing what God was doing in Jesus Christ amidst the harsh political realities and the economic uncertainties of his day. So must we. That is why John could tell us about Jesus' character, his power, and his unique worthiness. He was talking about someone he knew, not merely someone he had heard about. We need more Johns and Johnettas in the world today, in the church today, maybe you 5. After John anticipates and eviscerates the tradition argument, the crowd has a question. Actually, if you read this thing carefully, and I commend it to you, there are 3 different questions from 3 different groups in the crowd. The first question sounds like the kind of question you pose when you've lost the debate and now you're exhausted. Where are my married people at? You can't make this up. It's right here. In response to John, the crowd says, okay, what then should we do? What you should do, John says, is share. That's where he starts. Personal piety that strengthens the community. Sacrifice. God is not pleased when we are content with our too much while others have too little. New life in God is evidenced by a preoccupation that your neighbor's needs are met. John is a courageous preacher. He is not afraid of his wealthy listeners. You cannot preach the life-altering gospel to people you are afraid of. You damn sure can't set them free. After John tells the crowd to share, even the tax collectors come to be baptized. Check that out. And they bring their own version of the question. Teacher, it's very personal, very specific. Well, what should we do? But before John gets to answer that question, we who preach for a living and intend to preach for a living should take note right here. Good preaching leads to people posing good questions. And good answers to those questions come from preachers through pastoral care who know who they're talking to. If you are a tax collector, John says, in effect he says this, then be a good tax collector. Be a virtuous tax collector. Work out your salvation wherever you find yourself. Bloom where you are planted. Worship is how you make the next interaction and transaction. Make God's sense of justice your guide in the common things of life. John urges this specific group. John is a practical preacher. And practical preachers help people see and participate in the kingdom of God in the midst of the mundane. John's conviction is that nowhere can we serve God better, listen, than to simply do an honest day's work. No magic. An honest day's work is worship. Now, the last group, now come the soldiers and their question. And in us, what should we do? This one is particularly interesting if you know just a little bit of history. Don't forget John's context. John was a Jew living under the iron rod of Roman oppression, of which the soldiers were the tip of the spear, the occupying force. John could have easily, and we might have even given him permission to condemn this group categorically to their faces. But what John does here is to be bigger than any bias or partisanship he may bear. The gospel should make you bigger. Should make you bigger than you ordinarily would be. What you have to love about John is that John is that one somebody that believes that with God, everybody can have a next chapter. Even his enemies. We have faith for the people we love, but do you have faith for your enemy? John has a message, a redemptive message for people who don't necessarily like him, for people who don't agree with him, for people who don't vote like him. John tells the soldiers, stop victimizing the poor. The poor of the land do not exist as a source of your supplemental income. Did you get it? It's rich. John, the desert peasant, is telling the soldiers about power. A power greater than greed, a power greater than Rome. John preached a sovereign God, and John was not embarrassed or too shy to say that his God was bigger than all of the falsehoods and false gods on the ground. So must we be. At least be that. I hope it's clear why we, especially those of us who are ordained and who aspire to be ordained, need to spend some time with my boy John. 3 reasons. His vocational clarity, his vocational courage, his vocational capacity. John exemplifies all of that and one more thing: an extraordinary humility. What is John's theology? Jesus must increase, and I must decrease. That is what we have come to affirm today. Let's be clear. Not only you 5, but you have given us an excuse, again, to wash ourselves in this truth, lay and ordained, that this is Jesus' church, and that we minister in His name to His people, strengthening them with His sacraments. That's the whole thing right there. One of my favorite writers and poets died this week, Nikki Giovanni by name. At 104 pounds soaking wet, she was a tenacious writer and speaker in service to love and truth. In 1974, she wrote a poem called Revolutionary Dreams. That comes to mind as I think about you 5 and John the Baptist. Here's what she said. I used to dream radical dreams of blowing everyone away with my perceptive powers and my correct analysis. I even used to think I'd be the one to stop the riot and to negotiate the peace. And then I awoke and I understood that if I dreamed natural dreams of being a natural woman, doing what a natural woman does when she's natural, I would be a revolution. Trey, Mary Celis, Dominique, Peter, and Mary Grace. To be a deacon or priest is not the putting on of a costume or a new role, really. It is to go down deep into the natural warts and wonders of who you are because of who God is, and to God's glory. If you find it within yourselves to agree to do that today, you yourself may just become God's next revolution, just like John. I will bless the Lord at all times. God's praise shall continually be in my mouth.